Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get into it. So first we have Trump demands NBC to fire Seth Meyers immediately, despite legal protections related to satire under the Fair Use Doctrine and the principles embedded in the First Amendment from Yahoo.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for Seth Meyers or pretty much any late night TV host. They're all pretty much just DNC propaganda. But regardless, as I've stated many times in the past, the libertarian perspective is, free speech, even if you disagree with it. The libertarian perspective is, just let these guys be irrelevant rather than boost their ratings by going after them. Increasingly, no one watches late night TV. The only reason people even talk about late night TV anymore is because the Orange Man constantly brings it up. If the Orange Man were smart, he'd be going after Reddit or TikTok instead. Those are places more where the narratives are formed rather than the TV. But since he's very boomer, he still thinks TV is the most relevant thing ever, even though the TV and its control over the narrative has been declining over the past decade or so, especially thanks to social media. But yeah, I also find it interesting that a lot of progressives are saying, "Oh, we need to support Seth Meyers and his right to freedom of speech because and the First Amendment and all that." During Biden's term, they said, "Well, we need to censor anything that we deem to be hate speech or misinformation and use the force of the government to do so." It's very much that they only support free speech because the other branch of the Uniparty is in power right now. When their branch of the Uniparty gets back in, suddenly free speech will be the worst thing ever again. It just goes to show most people will just follow whatever the narrative is. One day they might be for free speech because their guy's in power, or their guy's not in power, but the next day they might be against free speech because their guy's in power. And it just goes to show they don't really have any like a lot of people these days, they don't have any consistent values when it comes to politics. Only teams. Next, we have Massey predicts a deluge of House Republicans will vote to release Epstein files from the Hill.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I don't know if that will be true or not. I like Massey. He's probably one of the good Republicans, but a lot of Republicans might not release the Epstein files because the Orange Man doesn't seem too keen about them. I think he did change his position recently. He says he wants them released so the Democrats can stop deflecting to them. But regardless, I do think we should they should be released. But regardless, I don't think Reddit thinks this is going to lead to another Trump impeachment. They always think the walls are going to close in on Trump. And in reality, I do think Trump's in there, but there's a lot of other powerful people in there, some from their side as well. I think that's important to remember. Reddit only cares about the Epstein files because the Orange Man's in them, but they don't care about any of their side in them. They only care that, like with the Trump supporters, all the politics of theirs just revolves around the Orange Man rather than anything else. And yeah, personally, I just want the Epstein files to be released and over with. But personally, I don't think anyone's going to accept the Epstein files unless they completely align with their narratives. And that's why I don't think even when they do come out, people might not accept them. They might they unless if they are released in full, maybe people would start viewing the government as illegitimate like it should be. And yeah, personally, I don't think anyone's going to be satisfied with them. They've been so built up at this point. People won't. I don't think people will be satisfied if they end up being put out. Next, we have This is a Fucking Disaster. Generational Republican Family News is 95-year-old mill to Trump's tariff mess from DailyWire.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Good News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think that's good news that a family lost their 95-year-old mill. Even if I think that would be more fit for the Leopards Ate My Face subreddit. But there are pretty much every subreddit is just some variation of the same r/politics DNC circle jerk at this point. Even if it markets itself as being different. And yeah, personally, I do think Trump's tariffs were bad, and I do think they probably were responsible for the closing of the mill. But regardless, Reddit only cares about tariffs right now because the outgroups, because they're Trump coded rather than non-Trump coded. Outgroup coded rather than in-group coded. If Biden was doing the exact same thing, Reddit would think they are the greatest things ever. And it just goes to show people would follow whatever the narrative is. It's like Reddit and free speech. They hated free speech when Biden was in office, but now they suddenly love free speech that Trump's in office, and I definitely think it would be the same when it comes to tariffs. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have FCC chairman repost Donald Trump's call for NBC to fire Seth Meyers immediately from Variety.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the television subreddit. And yeah, personally, it looks like it's been removed by the moderators of the television subreddit, but personally, I think, the libertarian position is we shouldn't have an FCC, we shouldn't have any free letter agencies, I don't personally care for Seth Meyers or any of his DNC circle jerking, just like I don't care for Jimmy Kimmel or any of his DNC circle jerking, or Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Fallon or the rest of them. Or John Oliver, you can add him in there as well, or Jon Stewart, there's a bunch of them. But, ultimately, I think the libertarian positions, a private TV network should be able to broadcast wherever they want. I personally don't really care for it, but you shouldn't be, as long as you're not forced to watch. I don't think they should be able to broadcast wherever they want. I guess you could argue, maybe they shouldn't be broadcasting stuff like snuff films, but ultimately, people people with the power and resources can ultimately broadcast wherever they want to, and if people don't care for it, they're free not to watch. Ultimately, I do think, the libertarian position is just let networks like NBC become irrelevant, because that's clearly the path they're on, with people increasingly questioning the narrative through social media rather than legacy media like NBC setting the narrative. And that's my thoughts on that issue. I think, Trump, he should just start ignoring NBC and ABC and CBS and all, and the like, and just instead of just constantly going after them and giving them relevance as a result. He's the president right now. He gives what he talks about is what's relevant. And, if he stops talking about them, I think they'll only lose relevance as a result. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Zero Respect for Private Property, posted by FastCRuvinus739, and that's a cross post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And it looks like a video from like YouTube or TikTok or something from GMV Podcast reporting ICE activity in Charlotte, South Boulevard, 11/15/25. And they added harassing people and coming onto private property without asking. And yeah, ultimately, I do think, private property is something that's very important when it comes to the libertarian perspective. But it's interesting. A lot of progressives who say, "Oh, you gotta respect private property. You just can't come onto my house without a warrant," or are usually against private property when the narrative says to. It says to be. They wanted the government to be all powerful and have no private property whatsoever when Biden was in office. But now that Orange Man's back in office, they think private property is suddenly one of the most important things ever. It's just like tariffs and free speech. They're not consistent. They'll just bend over for the government and start bootlicking them when their side's in power. But when the outgroup's in power, suddenly the government is the worst thing ever. And that's why you can't trust people. They'll just flip. A lot of the party that's not in power is always going to be more libertarian than the party that's in power, I would say, because when a lot of people just want a dictator they agree with, and I definitely think you see that when it comes to the presidency these days. A lot of people who were fine with anything Joe Biden did are now suddenly sounding like libertarians because Donald Trump's back in power, and vice versa. People just want the government to do whatever they want. They're completely fine with authoritarianism as long as it has the right letter next to its name, it seems. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have firm tied to Kristi Noem secretly got money from $220 million DHS ad contracts from ProPublica.org, posted by Tom13. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but the government is ultimately gonna benefit and give contracts to its own allies in big business, and that's why I don't really trust the government to be impartial. The government's always gonna have its own biases, just like everyone else, and they'll naturally seek to reward big private businesses that are ideologically tied and might even be owned by them. You saw with Joe Biden as well when they give all the benefits to all the NGOs and activist groups who support their message, and now the Republicans pretty much do the same thing. It's just they're both pretty much two sides of the same coin. Of course, Reddit would never call out Biden and his administration supporting NGOs and other activist groups that financially through the government. But when of course, when the out group does it, of course, it's gonna be the worst thing ever. But ultimately, they're pretty much just two sides of the same coin. Next, we have South Carolina looks at most restrictive abortion bill in the U.S. as opponents keep pushing limits, from APnews.com, posted by Dr. Who 07. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective in regard to abortion is, ultimately it's a property right thing like everything else. Ultimately, if you want to make abortion illegal on your own property, I think that's fine. But, ultimately, I think people are going to justify what they justify. I personally don't really care for super late term abortion. I guess you can make the argument that it is murder. Some people make the argument that's murder at any stage. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is, justify what you justify. If you want to justify murdering someone, that's ultimately on you. But, ultimately, if you want to justify getting an abortion, that's on you. That's on you too. And personally, I don't really care for how a lot of, I personally like the Bill Clinton era safe, legal, and rare rhetoric in regards to abortion, rather than today's left who seems to go, I get as many abortions as you want. It's empowering to women. But regardless, I think the libertarian perspective is that, people are going to justify what they justify, and that does include with abortion. And if you want to think it's the greatest thing ever, the worst thing ever, I think that's fine. But, the libertarian perspective is, justify what you want to justify in regards to it. And yeah, I think if people want it to be legal on their own property, they should be able to, same with pretty much anything else. But if you want to make it illegal on your property, I think that's fine as well. I think it's very much a property rights issue, just like every other topic, I would say. Next, we have Shays Rebellion, posted by Fear the Creeper, and they said in 1786, only a few years after the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States had to confront a crisis. A rebellion was brewing in the very same state where the war for American independence had begun only 11 years earlier. The roots of Shays Rebellion lay in their fact that under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government could not impose taxes on the people directly. It could only request money from the state governments, which alone held the power to tax their citizens. Wealthy merchants in Massachusetts convinced their state government to raise taxes on farmers in the western part of the state. Most of these farmers were veterans of the Revolutionary War. Throughout the war, these veterans received less than their full amount of earned pay for their service, some receiving no pay at all. Pensions were denied to most veterans. What farmers could not afford to pay these taxes, their farms were seized through foreclosure and sold at bargain prices to wealthy merchants. Some weren't able to pay, were sent to debtors' prisons. The veteran farmers felt abandoned and betrayed by their government, which had failed to pay them during the war and is now crushing their livelihoods. When the Massachusetts state government adjourned in 1786 without even looking at the petitions for debt relief, a group of over 1,000 farmers marched from the town of Northampton and prevented their court from convening to conduct foreclosure proceedings. The farmers called themselves regulators, referencing a similar rural uprising that had occurred in North Carolina prior to the Revolution. Daniel Shays was one of the farmers who took part in the march from Northampton. The next month, he was one of the leaders of a group of armed farmers who successfully intimidated the court in Springfield into adjourning without hearing any foreclosure cases. As the news of these uprisings spread through the nation, George Washington wrote nervously to one of his former aides that commotions of this sort, like snowballs, gather strength as they roll. In January 1787, Benjamin Lincoln, a former general in the Continental Army, raised money from Massachusetts merchants to recruit and equip a militia of 3,000 men to suppress the rebels. Thomas Jefferson opposed this, arguing if the rebels were free to secede from the Union, just as the Union had begun to be free to secede from England. When Jefferson wrote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants, its natural manure," he was talking about Shays' Rebellion. Meanwhile, Shays and other leaders of the rebellion marched from the federal arsenal at Springfield, hoping to seize the weapons stored there and use them to overthrow the state government. On January 25th, 1787, Shays' force of around 1,500 men approached the armory, which was defended by 1,200 state militia under Major General William Shepard. When morning shots failed to get Shays to hold his advance, Shepard ordered cannons to fire a grape shot at the approaching rebels, killing several and forcing them to retreat. They were pursued by the militia under Benjamin Lincoln, who had arrived from the eastern part of the state. In early February, Lincoln led his men on a night march through a snowstorm to surprise the rebel camp. The rebels who were not captured fled and dispersed into the countryside, many of them, including Shays, escaping over the border into New Hampshire and Vermont. Apart from a few small skirmishes, the rebellion is over. Today, if they tell the story of Shays' Rebellion at all, American public school history books claim that it shows that stronger federal government detail in the U.S. Constitution was necessary. Many libertarians disagree and ask why, after the federal government treated Shays and his fellow farmers in such an unjust way, the government was given more power in order to make it easier for the government to oppress them the next time. Sources: Isaac Mackos and Mike Rappaport. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is, I would agree with all that. The libertarian perspective is, ultimately, the founding fathers might have been libertarian when they were seceding from England, but the libertarian perspective is very much like Jefferson says, ultimately, if anyone wants to revolt at any time, they should have the right to do so. The government shouldn't have the legal monopoly on the use of force, and that's this is the Shays Rebellion was only the first of many instances of the U.S. government crushing rebellion against it through its legal use of its monopoly on the use of force. And it just goes to show you that just because a government says something doesn't make it true. Only 11 years prior, the U.S. Seceded from Britain because Britain said, "Oh, you don't have any taxation, you don't have any representation, even though we're going to tax you anyway." And they thought, it's time to secede from the Union, from Great Britain because of that. And ultimately, it just goes to show you that, um, a lot of people when they have power are gonna ultimately justify doing whatever they want with it. And ultimately, I think the libertarian perspective is, you should always be free to act against those in positions of state authority whenever you feel like it. Because just because they have legal monopoly on the use of force doesn't mean everything they're going to do is automatically correct. And the United States seemed to realize that when it was 1776, but just 11 years later, in 1787, with Shays' Rebellion, suddenly they were on the other side and the ones being the oppressors rather than the oppressed. And it just goes to show you that, ultimately, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We got to get rid of a centralized state and let everyone govern themselves rather than have a centralized state govern everyone. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have which type of tax is most damaging to economic growth, posted by JStocks QQQ, and that looks like a chart. Which taxes damage growth the most, and it lists five studies, and the first study says the worst is corporate income tax. The second study says the worst is corporate income tax. The third study says the worst is personal income tax. The third study says the worst is corporate. Fourth study says the worst is corporate income tax. And personally, I think so it mostly seems that the order is corporate income tax is the worst, and then personal income tax, then consumption tax, and then property tax. That's what free studies have, and the other one has corporate income tax and personal income tax flipped. And I would agree with that. By the OPI, it's more to recognize economy growth isn't the end all be all, but rather individual economic freedom and civil liberties. Not included in this analysis, the effects of taxes on those who are lower income rather than the economy as a whole. Also known as tariffs, although very say they are a type of consumption tax. It's important to note that property tax is different from land value tax. For all my fellow Georgians out there, some say land value tax actually boosts the economy. And personally, I think the libertarian perspective is, some taxes might be more justified than others, like a land value tax. But regardless, all taxation is a form of theft, since you don't consent to it. I think it's interesting our society is all about consent these days, but taxation is inherently anti-consensual, and that's why I think the libertarian perspective is, if we need to do have taxation, it needs to be voluntary first and foremost. Next we have, and they both consider themselves libertarian, posted by FastCWorthiness739, and that's a cross post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And that's one guy saying, I hired some guys to be at my house, and the other guy's on the phone saying, okay, I'm going to call the police because the TV told me they're stealing money from me via taxes to the government. And ultimately, I think the libertarian perspective is, if people want to hire guys to paint your house, you should be able to. And if you want to call the police on them for doing that, that's justify doing whatever you want to. But it's important to remember that the police are inherently an arm of the state. I think the libertarian perspective is, I would handle things myself rather than rely on the state to do so. Only use the state as a measure of last resort, be it in regards to police or healthcare or etc. or anything else. And that's very much the libertarian perspective on the matter. Next, we have egoism versus objectivism, posted by Narco Federation. That's a cross post from the Full Egoism subreddit. Goddamn it, Rand. And that looks like that meme from the second Star Wars movie, the prequels, the second one in the prequels. And it's a picture of Ayn Rand over Anakin Skywalker's face. He says, I'm an egoist. And then the picture of Max Stern over Padme's face. And he says, so you're going to take the inherent anti-capitalist roots of the philosophy, right? And then Ayn Rand's silent. And then Max Stern says, you're not going to slave yourself to the idea of capital and the advantage of the free market, right? And personally, I think the libertarian perspective is, if people want to worship the free market, they should be able to, but you need a free market. The free market does result in, unjust hierarchies like pretty much everything else, but, ultimately, hierarchies are always going to be a thing, and I think, the free market is probably the best way of going about them, and I think, just by doing what you're just if you want to sign up for Anders Turner, I think that's fine, as long as you're not forcing your beliefs on anyone else, and, as long as you're being more live and let live rather than, forcing your beliefs on everything else, as I said. Next, we have the Supreme Court made a horrible mistake when it gave Trump absolute power. In parentheses, who could see this coming, from the Hill.com post by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I wouldn't say Trump has absolute power right now, despite what Reddit says. Reddit might think he's a king or a dictator, but in reality, I think he's more par for the course. He might do some stuff like political theater wise, like sending the National Guard to cities, but otherwise, I don't think Trump's presidency would have been very different from a Kamala Harris presidency. And yeah, ultimately, I think it's all just a WWE style distraction from the fact that the deep state's still really the one who's running the country, like the military-industrial complex and the alpha agencies, FBI, CIA, NSA. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, is pedophilia bad? Trump supporters have really gotten to that point, from posted by Donald Key, and that's a post from the Cringe TikTok subreddit, and that looks like I think a TikTok video from Dean Wivers. This is a real conversation with Trump supporter, I guess, and Trump supporter is apparently defending pedophilia or something, I don't know. And yeah, personally, this reminds me of a comment I made recently. I replied to another guy who said only one side wants to protect pedophiles, and I replied, both sides want to protect the pedophiles of the in-group. At least the Republicans aren't calling theirs maps yet. Reddit, when the pedophiles on their side and they're not offending, it's like, oh, they're not pedophiles, they're just minor attracted persons. And it just goes to show you that people are always going to defend pedophilia as long as it's their side being the one doing it. I think the libertarian perspective is you gotta call it pedophilia, whether it's the in-group or the out-group doing it. If they have an R next to their name or D next to their name, or even an N next to their name, it's irrelevant. You gotta go after pedophiles regardless of where they stand on the political spectrum. With that being said, I think the left is, they don't have too high ground to operate on here, especially since they're the ones who've been pushing the maps stuff into the lexicon, and that's not very libertarian. If you want to call them maps, you should be able to call them maps, but I personally think you gotta call them pedophiles and it have to be stigmatized rather than saying, oh, they're not offending, they're minor attracted persons. That's just a deflection. You gotta go after pedophiles regardless of where they are on the political spectrum. And then I have another post I wanted to do, and I said, this is my the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, Libertarian perspective on the removal of monuments and memorials. It's not as hot a topic as it was back in 2020, but it's still worth discussing. The Women's College, town where I was born, used to have a historical marker dedicated to President Wilson. He used to teach there, but removed in 2020 because of his racist behavior. Before and after, it's still, and I linked to the screenshots on the Google Street View of it. It's still posted on Pokemon Go. I personally find Wilson to be an easily bottom 5 president, but I don't like to think that means you should erase all public acknowledgement of him. With that being said, it ultimately does come down to whatever the property owner is willing to justify, if I might disagree with it. It's a lot like how I disagree with Lester Maddox's decision not to serve black people at his restaurant, but ultimately that was his property, and he's free to use it however he felt like, as long as the parties involved were consenting. The parties involved, and I said thoughts. And I added, Wilson always interested me because he was the most recent president with a D next to his name that Reddit/academia are actively against. The next Democratic president literally put people in internment camps, and Reddit/academia will still defend him pretty much every time. And yeah, ultimately it does come down, I think it ultimately does come down to, like everything else, the property rights and who has the force and means to do what. That's very much a lot of life is it's who has the economic and social capital to get away with what they want to. And yeah, sometimes, I might not like it, but, people are going to justify what they justify, and that's very much a libertarian perspective, and that's true regardless of the system of government in place. People are going to justify what they justify. Sometimes people might get away with stuff that you don't like, the guy who assassinated Charlie Kirk. I personally don't really care for that, but, ultimately he justified it, and now Charlie Kirk's dead, so that's just kind of how life works. Sometimes bad things happen, and there's nothing you can do about it, and yeah, that's very much libertarian perspective. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.